If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Almitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
Hey there, Equity Warriors. Welcome to our Summer Professional Learning Series. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is the first of 10 special episodes that are designed to support you as a parent, caregiver, educator, leader, or supporter in your local schools. Now, if you're hearing but not seeing me, you know you're listening to the audio podcast. These sessions, especially these summer sessions, are being published on my YouTube channel with the PowerPoint presentation, handouts, and resources. So if you're not a subscriber there, look down in the notes for the link so that you can watch the PowerPoint and grab any handouts for the various sessions as they come up. So today's topic is the first of 3 episodes that I've developed particularly for parents, caregivers, and educators, but everyone in the audience can learn something from what I'll share today. Now, as parents, caregivers, educators, board members, leaders, and those who want to support our schools, we all want to see equity throughout our school systems. The question is, how do we do that? What is equity? And then what can you do to support it? Well, let's dig in. In today's workshop, I'll start by defining equity in the K-12 education. I'll talk about the impact of educational inequity on children of color. We'll get a brief overview of intersectionality, some basics of intersectionality. I'll share with you some strategies for addressing inequity, and I'll discuss the role of parents, caregivers, and the general public. So let's start with what is equity and why does it matter? Well, we all need a basic definition. We need to understand the difference between equity and equality and a little bit of historical context to help wrap it all up. So equity, I define simply as being without bias against or favoritism for. Very simple, but there's a lot behind that. So equity in K-12 education is a principle that refers to the fair and just distribution of resources and opportunities for all children, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, ability, or socioeconomic status. Unlike equality, which simply means treating all students the same, equity recognizes that different students have different needs and that fairness requires treating them differently so that their outcomes, what they get at the end, is equal. So for an example, if I had 2 students in my classroom, one whose only language was English, it was their first language, it was their only language, and another student who was an emergent bilingual learner, English being their second language, but they had a home language, let's say it was Spanish. That was very common in my classroom. If I were to treat those 2 children equally, it means I would give them both the same curriculum, I would give them both the same assignments, I would give them both the same supports, and I would expect them to perform at the same level. But that wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be right. So the student who speaks English as a second language would not have the same opportunities for learning and success as my student who only spoke English. If I want to have equity, I need to provide my emergent bilingual learner with additional support. I need to provide language crosswalks, so to speak, so that when they don't understand what a word means in English, I can give it to them in their primary language and help make that connection quite quickly. I need to use additional strategies so that they will have equal access to the same level of instruction and then equal access to the same outcomes. Okay, so language instruction, accommodations to make sure they have the same opportunities. So why is equity so important? Why is everybody making such a stink about equity? Well, to understand this, we need to look at the historical context of education, and we're going to get to that. Equity is a central principle in our modern schools. And when we recognize and address the unique, different needs of different students and groups, that's how we begin to create a fair education system where every student, your child, and your child, and your child, and their children have the opportunity to succeed. So, key distinctions between equity and equality when we talk about schools. Equality means giving all students the same thing, treating all students the same way. And some of us might think, well, that's fair. We should treat everybody the same way. But is it though? If I have a student who is confined to a wheelchair, I cannot expect them to participate in the regular PE class like my able-bodied learners. That would be equal, but it would not be equitable. It would not be fair. So treating all students the same doesn't sound bad, but in many ways it can be. Equity recognizes that different students have different needs. Okay, so providing those additional resources or that altered opportunity so that students who have been historically marginalized, who may be differently abled, who may be disadvantaged, have access and opportunity to have the same success. So there's that. All right. So equity versus equality. In terms of history, this concept of equity in our schools as they are today has their roots in history, primarily through the context of civil rights and social justice movements. So in the United States, there was Brown versus Board of Education, a Supreme Court decision in 1954 that declared that segregated schools across the nation were unconstitutional. And that's what led to the desegregation of public schools. Depending on how old you are, you might remember being bused to another, maybe it was your parents who were bused to another side of town so that the schools could be racially balanced, okay? Before that, even, there was a California Supreme Court decision that doesn't get talked about very often called Westminster versus Mendoza that made it illegal for schools that segregated Mexican children from white children, illegal. But still, with all these legal bans on segregation, a lot of schools remained racially and socioeconomically segregated, and that has led to this history of unequal opportunities and unequal outcomes for our students. Another Supreme Court finding was Lau versus Nichols, and that's where we got legislation that provides for language development for our emergent bilingual learners. So if you're wondering where those ELD classes came from, this is the law behind it. That's where that came from. And so we have to watch and be diligent about making sure that the rights that were so difficult for our children to obtain are not taken away by some of what's going on in the politics of education today. But let me not go down that rabbit hole. That civil rights movement, 1960s, 1970s, called for equal access to education for all students, regardless of their race, their socioeconomic status. And then we had the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975. It's what we now know as the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or IDEA, that made sure that students with disabilities received equal access to education. Recently, this concept of equity in education has been expanded and includes recognizing that students have different needs, they have different strengths, they have different challenges. And so our schools have to provide individualized support to meet these needs, just as I discussed with my learner who speaks English at home and my learner who speaks Spanish at home, if instruction in the class is in English. You have to provide individualized support to meet those needs. So systemic inequalities in funding, in resources, and in teacher quality often result in unequal educational outcomes for marginalized students. If I were not credentialed in language acquisition, in teaching emergent bilingual learners, and my child in my classroom instead had been assigned to someone who did not know how to address the learning needs of an emergent bilingual learner, that would be unequal access. That would be inequitable for your child. Okay, that's what we're talking about. So the relevance of equity in our schools is evident when we look at achievement gaps. When we look at the outcomes between students of different races and students of different socioeconomic backgrounds. So Black and white, brown and white, or Latina and white. When we look at those gaps, in their learning, when we look at bilingual or emergent bilingual learners versus English only learners, when we look at children who qualify for free and reduced lunch versus children who are more affluent, we see these gaps. And we measure those gaps using a nationwide tool called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. And the NAEP tells us that these gaps persist across academic subjects, reading, math, social studies, science, and it persists across grade levels. So whether it's second grade, fourth grade, well, the NAEP isn't second grade, so fourth grade, eighth grade, 12th grade. When we measure students across the country with the same examination, the NAEP, and we look at the data, the outcomes based on race and based on socioeconomic level and based on home language, we find these gaps, okay? And making sure that our children have equitable access means we have to be committed, not just as parents and caregivers, but as parents and caregivers, making sure our educators, our teachers, our principals, our superintendents, our school boards are committed to providing equal opportunities for all students, regardless of who they are, regardless of where they come from, regardless of the language that they speak, so that they can succeed academically in school and that they can succeed in life outside of school. Okay, let me define educational inequity now. This is the unequal distribution of resources and opportunities in education. It means having lesser qualified teachers in schools where our students have greater needs of learning, where our schools have more English learners, emergent bilingual learners, children who speak one or more languages, even children who speak a socio-cultural language. Maybe it's a more Black children who speak African-American vernacular English, or maybe it's South Central LA where you've got children who speak Chicano English, but you don't have teachers that know how to teach students from those backgrounds, okay? So lesser qualified educators may be there. Resources may not be appropriate. They may not have the right tools, the right materials, the right books. They may not have the right approaches. So educational inequity is particularly hazardous for marginalized learners and our children of color. So disparities in funding, how much money they get, access to quality teachers, access to appropriate curriculum, and then things you'll also see like higher suspension rates or more disciplinary actions taken against our children of color. That is educational inequity. Historically, and even now in 2023, we have seen so many examples of educational inequity that affect our children of color. During segregation, Black students and Latino students, Mexican students in California specifically, were forced to attend schools that were underfunded and that were poorly resourced, that got secondhand textbooks, that got teachers that maybe were not credentialed, okay, while white students went to well-funded, high-quality schools. We still see that today. We still see these disparities in funding. We still see the disparities in resources and in teacher quality in our low-income communities. And that disproportionately, because of the way this country has been structured and legislated, disproportionately affects our children of color. Hey there, Equity Warriors. I want to take a quick moment to share something exciting with you. You know how passionate I am about equity in education, right? Well, I've created a special space, a safe space, where we can dive even deeper into these crucial topics. It's our Patreon channel, and I'd love for you to join me there. Here's why it's so awesome. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll get access to exclusive content that I will not share anywhere else. I'm talking additional insights, workshops like you would get in regular professional learning sessions, resources that can really amplify your impact in education. But it's more than just extra content. By subscribing, you are directly supporting our mission. You're helping to create more valuable discussions and resources that you've come to love. You're part of the change we're making in educational systems. And let me tell you, our Patreon community, it is something special. It's a place where passionate educators and advocates can come together, share ideas, and drive real change. So if you're ready to take your commitment to educational equity to the next level, I'd be thrilled to have you join me. Just head over to patreon.com/3E podcast. That's patreon.com/3E podcast. Remember, your support means the world to me, and it helps me continue this important work. Together, we can create the educational system all our students deserve. Thanks for considering, and now let's get back to the episode. So, consequences of this inequity hits individuals and communities very significantly. When our children are not provided with resources and the opportunities that they need to succeed, it can have a negative impact on their academic achievement, their self-esteem, and their overall health and well-being. And this can lead to higher rates of dropouts, lower rates of college attendance, and reduced opportunities then for higher paying jobs and for career advancement later on as adults. In addition to the individual consequences, educational inequity has a big impact on communities, on neighborhoods. When we have large groups of students that don't have access to quality education, that are not given the tools that they need to succeed, we have cycles of poverty and reduced economic mobility. And it can perpetuate social inequalities and make worse the disparities that already exist in our society. Everything from food security and housing security to incarceration. These inequities that begin in school have long-lasting impacts on the child, the individual person, and communities as a whole. We know from a lot of research that children who experience educational inequity are much more likely to experience negative outcomes in their adult lives. It could be encounters with the justice system. It could be lower income. It could be poorer health. And the inability to be socially mobile. So if we want to address educational inequity, we have to first acknowledge it is existing, it is real, and we have to understand its impact, all of those consequences we see on screen. When we recognize the impact of educational inequity on children of color and the communities that they live in, we can then start creating a more equitable system of schools that provides every child with the resources and opportunities that they need to succeed. And one way to do that is to start by giving more funding and resources for schools in low-income communities, because many of our children of color are concentrated in those low-income communities. This way, we start providing for better teacher training and professional development. We get access to technology, not just in school, but maybe in the community as a whole. And we get higher quality curriculum that is designed to work for the children in those schools. We can improve our school facilities, and we can get resources that are needed because of the lived experiences of these children. Another way to address educational inequity is through policy that supports diversity and inclusion in schools. And this is one thing that is under attack in too many states in this country right now. We need programs that promote cultural competency and understanding in the teachers that teach our children of color. We need initiatives to recruit and retain a more diverse group of teachers and administrators. And if you are an administrator or school board member listening to this episode, stay tuned this summer, because I do have one that's coming that is specifically on recruiting and retaining diverse educators and administrators. All right, here we go. Intersectionality. So what is this intersectionality thing? So we have multiple identities. And if you look at the graphic that's on screen, right, you'll see male, white, European, heterosexual, able-bodied, etc. And underneath sort of those lesser identities, English as a second language, poor, unattractive, old, non-literate, LGBTQ, persons with disabilities, people of color, right? Sometimes many of us, or most of us, probably have multiple identities. The challenge is how those identities connect. How does our race, gender, sexuality, class intersect? Because those intersections create unique experiences of inequity. Because depending on the multiple aspects of our identity, we may be discriminated against or marginalized more or less. Here's an example. If we have a child who is female and of color, their experiences of discrimination and marginalization are unique and much more negative than someone who is a female but white. A person who is both LGBTQIA plus and comes from a low income background has different barriers to access resources and opportunities compared to someone who is only LGBTQIA plus or only from a low income background. And it's important to recognize intersectionality when we're talking about equity, because it allows us to understand how complex and how unique lived experiences of our children are, and how they face discrimination and how they are marginalized or ignored, how they are treated because of the multiple aspects of their identity. When we as adults, especially educators, teachers, school leaders, school board members, superintendents, when we acknowledge and address the ways in which different identities intersect, we can begin to work towards a more equitable and just system of education. But my parents and caregivers that I designed this lesson for, this workshop for, you need to know what the intersectionalities are of your child and how that is impacting their education. And then you have to work to help leaders and teachers in your schools recognize how that's impacting their instruction when there is inequity in your school. So what are some strategies for doing that? Well, one way to address intersectionality is by ensuring that policies and programs designed to promote equity do take into account the multiple identities of experiences of individuals and groups. For example, if there's a program that's designed to support low-income students, it may also need to take into account the additional barriers that are faced by students who are also Black or also emergent bilingual, are also English learning, are also have a learning disability or a physical disability. Okay, so what are the policies and programs? Another way to address intersectionality is by promoting awareness and understanding of all the ways in which different identities intersect. This may mean that we need more training and education for our teachers, for our leaders, for our board members, so that they can increase their understanding of the experiences of our learners and the ways in which our learners are affected by systemic inequities, by the inequities that are baked into the way our schools are structured, the way curriculum treats the different identities that our children have. And we're going to have curriculum in episode 48. I think it's the next episode coming up. We'll talk about curriculum and instruction there. Okay, first let's start with strategies for addressing inequity in schools. Okay, so one strategy is to increase funding and resources for low-income communities. This helps make sure that all students have access to quality teachers, curriculum, and facilities. So parents and caregivers, watch the school's budget. Where is the money going? And is it going to address the needs of children that are victims of inequity? Another strategy is to address the opportunity gap. This is about the disparity, the difference in access to educational opportunities and access to honors and advanced placement coursework to extracurricular activities. Why is golf only offered at the affluent schools and not offered in our lower income schools? These gaps that exist between students from different socioeconomic backgrounds, as well as different racial backgrounds. Another important strategy is to call out bias and discrimination in our schools. This may mean, again, training teachers and staff on cultural competency, parents and caregivers demanding that teachers and staff get trained on cultural competency, that they understand diversity and equity, that they know how to teach diverse learners, that your leaders, your school board members are creating policies and practices that promote diversity and inclusion, and making sure that every single child feels valued and supported in their classroom. Where do they come from, these inequities, right? We've seen sort of that historical foundation, but wherever it's coming from, the impact of inequity is a consequence for our children of color. And we can measure equity and identify inequity by relying on the 4 equity indicators you see on screen. Now, if you're new to this podcast and you're not familiar with the 4 equity indicators, make a note, write this down. You're going to want to go all the way back and listen to episode number 4. Now, episode number 4 is not on YouTube. It's only going to be found on the audio channels. So podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, audio channels, right? Not on YouTube. There's no video to go with that. That's episode 4. Go back, take a listen to that so you understand those equity indicators with a little more depth. It will be addressed in other episodes this summer. All right. Also important to recognize the role of privilege in perpetuating inequities. Privilege refers to advantages and benefits that certain individuals receive because of their social identity, because of their race, usually white, because of their gender, more often male, or because of their socioeconomic status, more often wealthier. Privilege, white privilege, wealth privilege, male privilege. When we acknowledge and understand privilege, we can help to promote equity by encouraging individuals, whether it's your child's teacher, principal, counselor, board member, superintendent, to recognize their privilege and their bias because of their privilege, and then working towards creating a more equitable and just school system. So what can you do as a parent or caregiver? What practical steps can you take to promote equity in your child's school? Well, one important step is to get involved. Stay engaged in the school community. This may mean attending school board meetings, volunteering in the classroom, advocating for policies and practices that promote equity and inclusivity. Now, I recognize many of our parents don't have the time to be heavily involved in the school system, actually getting out there and engaging with school board meetings, with volunteering in the classroom. You don't have the time because you have to work 1, 2, 3 jobs to keep a roof over your heads and to keep food in your children's stomachs. But there are others of us who do have the time. And maybe your children are out of the house, or maybe you just feel a desire to advocate for children. These are things you can do. And those parents who do have the time, don't just advocate for your child. Advocate for your neighbor's child, for your community's children, for those children whose parents can't come to school because of economic circumstances. Another important step that you can do is to support and amplify the voices of our marginalized and underrepresented groups in the school community, our children of color, our children who speak a language other than English when they're at home, the children who have low-income households, children who don't have parents that have higher levels of education, right? Address and support their concerns for their families. Advocate for policies and practices that support their success. Parents and caregivers, you can also work to educate yourselves and your children about issues of equity and social justice. Now, this can include reading books and articles on your own, attending workshops and trainings that may be offered at school, or Heck, just listening to my podcast where I'm going to give you some training and information about equity and social justice. It also means having open and honest conversations with your children about these issues. After all, they're the ones sitting in classrooms all day, every day, being subjected to inequity. So addressing inequity in our schools requires an approach from many different sides. It means increasing resources and opportunities for all children, particularly those of color, those who are marginalized. Addressing bias and discrimination and recognizing the role of privilege in keeping inequity rooted in our school systems. Parents and caregivers, you play an important role in promoting equity in your children's school by getting involved and engaged, by supporting marginalized and underrepresented groups, and by educating yourselves and your children on issues of equity and social justice. When we work together, we can create a more equitable education system that supports the success of all students. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've gotten a few new tools and strategies, not only for understanding what equity is, but for taking action and addressing it in your school systems. Now, continue to join me every week, especially this summer where I'm giving you these more targeted workshops. But send me your questions, topics, requests to askdrberry.com, and I will answer your questions, and I will continue to bring you information and experts to help address those topics. Now, I'm going to ask you to do something for me. I need you to like this episode. I need you to share this episode. I need you to subscribe, turn on notifications so that you know when the next episode drops. And as always, don't worry about the things you cannot change. Change the things you can no longer accept. And I'll see you next week.
That's it for today's episode of the 3E Podcast. Head over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on iTunes will win a chance in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 value private VIP day with Dr. Berry herself. Be sure to head over to 3epodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Dr. Berry's gift. Then join us on the next episode.